Welcome to the Property Podcast, the home of news and debate about building long-term wealth from property investment for beginners and experts alike. And now for your hosts. They may not be as cool as me, but they do know their property. It's Rob and Rob.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, Episode 9. I'm Rob Bentz, and with me as always, Rob, the Property Geek Dix. How are you, Rob?
Hello, Rob. I'm very well, thank you. I was going to say hola, but I think I'm going to drop my Eurovision bit from now on. But I'm joining you from Madrid this week.
I'm sounding more like a boxing sort of a commentator every time I start this show, so I've got to be aware of that. I think it's Rick's influence. His smooth tones have got me more like that.
Yeah, well, the debate rages on.
So, Rob, what have we got coming up this week?
Well, this week we are half emptying our glasses. We're going to be focusing on property disasters, talking about the truly terrible things that can happen to you in your investing career, but so you don't need to worry about it, we're also going to tell you what to do about them. And if you stick around to the end, we're going to share a resource that might just become a vital part of your property research process.
That's a great resource. I use it on a weekly basis as I do most of these resources, so make sure you have a look. And once again, it's free and easy to use. But Rob, as always, we want to pass on our thanks to our podcast reviews on iTunes, to the people who've been kind enough to go there. So a round of applause to the following, please. First of all, Kev says, great content, informative and quick pace. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Kev.
Thank you, Kev.
Benjamin says, I'm looking for an investment with my hard-earned cash, so this podcast was a solid gold find. Thanks, Rob and Rob. I'll be following your advice. Thank you, Ben. And Matthew says, excellent podcast. Thank you, Matthew. Fraz says, very useful, very engaging. Love that you don't preach to your audience, but collectively you bring the podcast into an objective light. As property investment clearly isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, I find the resource of the week particularly useful. Keep up the great work. Thank you very much, Fraz. And finally, what a review this is. This is from Nemesis888, and Nemesis says, I wish this podcast had been available when I started in property 8 years ago. In my experience, things can go wrong rapidly and expensively wrong. If you listen to the wrong advice and blindly venture into property markets thinking you're the next Branson or Sugar. Thanks, Rob and Rob. You're too late for me, because I've already gone from hero to zero, but your sound advice will ensure the next crop of investors start on a much firmer foundation than I did. Wow, that's some review. I spoke to Rob before the show, and Nemesis, if you're listening, we'd love you to get in touch, because we'd love to create a show around your experiences, and so people can learn from your mistakes and you can help put people on a better footing. Now, hopefully this episode will be a start of that and will help a lot of people avoid mistakes, but we were quite blown away by that review, weren't we, Rob?
We were, and it's always worth being reminded that property can go very wrong if you listen to the wrong people. I don't know if I'd say that property disproportionately attracts people who can kind of set you off in the wrong direction, but then I suppose anything where there's lots of money sloshing around will attract people who might not have the best of intentions. And so, yeah, we're very sorry to hear that it sounds like you've been bitten by something like that and not had the best experience. The more of those stories we can showcase, the more we can make people aware of the importance of doing your research and making sure that you approach it sensibly, because property is fantastic if you approach it in the right way.
So, Nemesis, if you are listening, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. You can either leave us a recording or you can email us. Whatever's easiest, please get in touch. We'd love to speak with you.
Well, let's move on then to talk about the news from this week. And we've had a couple of great pieces of news this week, haven't we?
Massive pieces of news, massive. Entrepreneur on fire. Okay, so in a recent podcast, I mentioned, and I was listening in the garden to Entrepreneur on Fire and a couple of interviews there. Now, for those who don't know, it's a massive podcast. They get to nearly 250,000 listeners every single month. And we mentioned on Twitter, John Dumas, the presenter, let him know on Twitter that we'd mentioned him in our episode, and then he got in touch, didn't he, Rob?
He did, which is just amazing. It's just like everything we mentioned is coming true at the moment. He got in touch with us, which was amazing, and we're both going to be appearing separately on Entrepreneur on Fire in the next couple of months, each kind of telling our own story in property and out of property. So that's just absolutely fantastic for us.
Yeah, we can't wait. We're really excited about that. Now, it's a few months away because the amount of entrepreneurs they have lined up is substantial, and it's a big podcast, but when that comes around, we will certainly let you know. But we're probably looking at July, August before that happens, but we'll definitely let you know when that comes about. And also, we've heard from Pete Matthew, and Pete, who runs the Meaningful Money podcast, which is a great podcast we mentioned in episode 4, and he was kind enough to leave us this recording.
Hi, Rob and Rob. This is Pete Matthew from Meaningful Money and the Meaningful Money podcast. Just wanted to say a quick thank you for the mention on the property podcast and the great review that you gave me, and also for taking the time to leave a review on iTunes as well. It really is massively appreciated. And it got me thinking, actually, I'd love to have one or both of you on the Meaningful Money podcast, because you've inspired me to do a session about property investing. I will drop you an email perhaps as well, and it'd be great to perhaps open a dialogue, and if you guys are willing to do that. Thank you again very much. I really appreciate it. More power to you, and all the very best for the property podcast, which looks and sounds to me as if it's going from strength to strength. Cheers.
Wow, that's very, very generous of you, Pete. Thank you very much. We would love to join you, wouldn't we, Rob?
We would. I was, again, really excited to be on it because it's a podcast that I really admire. I only got turned on to it when Rob mentioned it back in episode 4 as a resource of the week. I started listening, and I'd never thought about using a financial advisor before. I think I kind of arrogantly thought that I could do it all myself. But listening to Pete has kind of made me realise what an important role having a financial advisor can play in your investing career. And I really like the way that he gives you great information, he gives you actionable advice. And so if we can get on there and sort of share what we have to say with his audience, then that's just going to be great.
We certainly will be taking Pete up on his offer. We'll let you know when that recording goes out. And he recently released episode 10, and he gave us a very kind mention there as well. So make sure you pick up that recording. We'll put it in our show notes, of course, but we look forward to those upcoming interviews and podcasts. So, news of the week. Rob, we've got more good news.
And once again, we're taking our news from the Daily Express. We've got to be careful about this.
They probably are on the most extreme side of optimism when it comes to property, but they do get a good headline. The Daily Express, apparently, Rob, we're going to see 30% property rises in 2 years.
I am personally just going to rush out and buy everything I can find this week, because in 2 years, I'm guaranteed to be able to get an extra 30% for it, which is just brilliant. Who would have thought that just a vague piece of legislation that hasn't even been properly outlined yet could cause this huge boom?
I think that's the end of this podcast. Go and buy property and enjoy the rewards. We're a little bit sceptical. 30% in 2 years, it's not going to happen. I'd love it to happen, because I'd be a lot wealthier, but I can't see it happening. The reason why we brought this news piece to you is not to mock it, but really just to highlight how many good news stories are coming out on property at the moment. It's sort of gained momentum since the podcast begun, strangely enough. I do believe that we are now going to see property prices ticking up over the next few years. I'm confident enough to say that. The reason why is confidence is a massive part of it. And if the media keeps telling people that property is going to go up, it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. It's more likely to happen. I do think property prices will rise over the next 2 years. I'm bullish enough to say that. 30%? No, nowhere near. But a rise is a rise, and I'll take it.
Rightly or wrongly is up to you, but it does feel like the media and the government are doing their utmost to talk the market back into a state of activity. As an investor, I'd say that that's got to be good news for us. In recent years, it feels like the only people who've actually been selling are those who have to sell very quickly, which theoretically means that there are lots of bargains around, but it also means that anyone non-desperate is just sitting it out and there's not that much to pick from. From an investor's point of view, it means that if there's more activity in the market, more people are buying, more people are selling, it means it's going to be easier to get comparables to support valuations you're trying to get. It's going to be easier to pull off buy to sell if that's your technique. And hopefully with sellers coming back into the market in a realistic frame of mind, it means we're going to have more deals to pick from. I don't know what's going to happen to prices, but it does feel like everyone's trying to talk the activity back. And as an investor, I think that's great news.
We can't argue with that.
The other piece of news that we wanted to mention briefly is that we were talking a few weeks ago about how to choose a letting agent. And one of our big complaints was that letting agents are unregulated. It's a totally unregulated sector. Anyone can set up as well. And that's still the case, but there is some new legislation proposed that is going to bring some form of regulation to letting agents. Essentially, it seems to be the case that anyone can still set up as a letting agent, but there's going to be some kind of formal redress if you get treated shoddily by one. So it's all still a bit vague, and it's not something we're going to go into in great detail, but we'll put a note in the show notes linking over to a news story about that, so you can read more about the latest development with letting agents. Let's move on then to our topic of the week, which is property disasters. And this was motivated actually by an iTunes review we got from a listener who said that he wanted to hear us talk more about the negative side of property investment. As we heard from our reviewer earlier as well, Nemesis, there are negative stories out there. And we want to be responsive to what you want to hear, so we wanted to cover it. And if there's anything else you want us to cover, do leave us a comment or drop us a review and let us know. We try very hard on this show to be balanced, and we'd never suggest for a second that investing is easy money or risk-free or anything like that. We're just naturally optimistic and enthusiastic about property because we love the sector and we're fascinated by it, but also because even though there are all these setbacks that we're going to talk about, and you will inevitably hit one or two of them along the way at some point, property is a phenomenal investment over the long term. But we're going to focus on some of those setbacks, and most importantly, we're going to tell you what to do about them. Some of the things you can do proactively to reduce the chances of them happening, and some of them, so when the worst happens, you know what to do about it, so you're not going to lose too much sleep over it. Let's get on with the first one then, Rob. The first one is a big one that you hear from a lot of people who you speak to, I know.
A lot of newbie investors who come to me, not all of them, but a lot of the concerns are common. There's common themes to them all. And one of the big ones is, what happens if I can't rent out my property? There's two ways to look at this. What happens if you can't rent out the property you're looking to buy? And what happens if you can't rent out the property you've already bought? So let's look at the first scenario. If I wanted to buy a property, how can I increase my chances of making sure that the property will get let? Well, the big one is research. What you want to do is you want to look at your area that you're targeting. In the previous episodes, we've talked about fundamentals, shops, schools, transport links, major employment, major investments, all those things. That are they applicable to that area? If so, then you're instantly going to improve your chances. They also look at the amount of rent you're hoping to attract. Be realistic. Call up the letting agents like we've talked about in the past. Mystery shop them as a tenant and as a landlord, to get both sides of the story. And find out what a realistic market rent will be for that property. So when you're putting your figures together, one, the area is going to have a good tenant demand because of all the fundamentals. And two, the amount you projected is realistic. If you do those two things, then when you come to let the property, if you have a good letting agent, again, you've done by research, and previous podcasts, we talked about how to find a letting agent. If you've not listened to that, go back and listen to it. If you apply those principles, then the letting agent, the area being a strong area, the rent being a realistic market rent, then all those combined will then make sure that you've got a very good chance of letting out your property. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario is, what happens if your tenant leaves and then you can't get it let out again? If you've done stage one that I've talked about, then that's unlikely, but it could happen. So it's down to one or two reasons. One, you've got a poor letting agent, or two, your rent is too high. What you would do is, first of all, with your current letting agent, if after a few weeks it's not let, then reduce the price. Then after a couple more weeks, if there's still no interest and the property's not going anywhere, bring in an additional agent. I'm not saying necessarily get rid of your original one, but bring in an additional one, because it's nearly always down to those two facts. Now, the third one, it could be your property's in poor condition, but hopefully you're honest enough with yourself to recognise that. A bit of paint and, new carpets if needed will do a world of wonders to any property. It's normally the letting agent or the pricing. Hopefully you've identified that the property is not at fault. They're all the things you can do to prevent or stop your property from being let out. If you go ahead and do all those things that I've mentioned, then that risk, that downfall, that disaster is far less likely to happen.
If you've got a property you already own and you can't find anyone to rent it, I take that as feedback. Like you say, it's to do with the condition or to do with the rent. Tenants aren't silly. If you're trying to charge over the odds for something which just isn't in prime condition, they're going to know about it, and yours is going to be the last to be picked. And I've seen this happen in areas where demand has fallen for some areas, and the good properties and the realistically priced properties are always fine, but it's the one right at the bottom end where the landlords have been kind of neglecting maintenance and it's kind of letting it tick along for years and years and years. Suddenly they find that it's empty. But that's just feedback, and it means you've got to do something about it. Hopefully, like you say, you're doing things properly in the first place, and that's not going to happen. But in general, it's feedback because the population isn't getting any smaller, new homes aren't being built at any great rate, and there's always going to be a strong demand for property. If you do things correctly, you should always be able to find a tenant, I reckon.
I agree.
The next disaster that could happen is property prices falling. And I would say this isn't really a disaster at all. It's at best an opportunity, and at worst something that you can happily ignore if you're doing things sensibly. Because property prices will fall at some point. If you're looking at a 20, 30-year investment horizon, at some point during that 20, 30 years, prices will fall. And it doesn't matter. It only matters if you need to sell or remortgage at that time. The key to prepare for this is to make sure that you don't put yourself in a position where you have to sell at any point. And that means having a decent amount of equity in your property, not using 100% mortgage, not that you can these days, but just not taking your mortgage too high, making sure that you're getting your figures right so you're making a good monthly profit. So that means that you can cope if interest rates go up or if your costs go up. It just means you make less profit rather than pushing you into a position where you have to subsidise the property. And keeping money aside for voids and unexpected bills. If you do that, then if prices fall, you're never going to have to sell and you can just ride it out. Because over the long term, at the very least, the price of your asset will go up in line with inflation. If the price of your property is gradually going up over the time, your debt, if you've got a mortgage, is staying static. So effectively, your debt is being inflated away. So over the long term, it's really nothing to worry about at all. You just have to see it as a blip. You could even say if property prices fall, great. You can just ride it out with your own properties and you can take the opportunity to pick up another one on the cheap while prices are down. So that of all the disasters, I'd say if you set things up properly in the first place, it's really not a disaster at all. It's possibly an opportunity in disguise.
You'll only lose money on a property if you're forced to sell. That's the key point there. I've got a property that's in negative equity. I bought it right at the top of the market, so I didn't see the credit crunch coming. I'd be a lot wealthier if I did. But I'm not worried. It's just one of the properties in the portfolio. It is in negative equity. However, the cash flow is fantastic. It's still an asset that's paying me every single month. And already the property prices in that area have recovered. And actually, I say negative equity, but I'd probably break even on the mortgage now if I sold it. Not that I ever would, because it rents really well. I've never had a void period in that property, and the cash flow I make on it is fantastic. So do I regret buying it? Not at all, because it's an asset for the long term.
If it's making you money, why would you ever sell it anyway?
Exactly. That's an asset. Next, what happens if your tenant stops paying rent? Now, in this case, prevention is better than cure. You want to make sure that when you find your tenant, if you're doing the searches, you properly vet them. You do all the credit checks, you get references, you get a guarantor if needed. You can do all that. And if you use a letting agent, which I do, then you can use the letting agents to do all that for you. Now, I'm not saying you necessarily have to put all your trust into a letting agent you don't know. Hopefully, if you've listened to our previous podcast where we talk about how to find a letting agent, you've found a fantastic letting agent who doesn't just put anybody into your property to get it quickly let, but they do a fantastic job and they get you a really good quality tenant that comes with all the good references, comes with good credit rating, comes with guarantor if needed, so that you're completely safe if anything goes wrong. Because if the guarantor is a good guarantor and your tenant does stop paying, then you should be covered. It's only if your guarantor is as weak as a bad tenant that you have to worry. A lot of that can be prevented by either doing thorough checks yourself or working with a really good letting agent who you know and trust will carry out those searches on your behalf. Now, it's not to say that nothing will ever go wrong if you do all of that, but it will reduce your risk massively. If your tenant does stop paying, then you need to make sure that your letting agent, again, if you're using one, is on the ball and knows all the procedures to solve the problem quickly. Now, it may be a genuine reason that they've stopped paying and you may need to mediate with your tenant to find a solution that works for both parties. Or it may be that you've got a bad tenant who has no intention of ever paying your rent. Hopefully you've prevented that by what I've just said. If your tenant suddenly does have a change of personality and that happens, then you need to make sure that if your letting agent's involved, that they are on the ball and they know the laws and regulations to get that tenant out ASAP in the lawful way. And if you haven't got a letting agent, then you need to make sure you're on top of those laws and regulations as well. Now, it's a massive topic, the laws and regulations of property investment and buy-to-let, and we'll cover that in an individual podcast. But if you are going alone, you need to make sure you're on the money when it comes to that type of thing.
Yeah, you do, because evictions and so forth, it's not a quick and easy process anyway. And if you get the slightest thing wrong, then the whole thing can be thrown out and set you back by another couple of months when you're still not getting paid. And it's not good. I mean, tenants not paying is not a good thing. So you've got to do as much as you possibly can to protect yourself against that happening. Again, it feels like a disaster at the time, but it probably will happen despite your best efforts. If you've got enough properties for enough years, you'll have a bad experience at some point. You just have to do the best that you can to stop it from happening. And then if it does happen, deal with it quickly and effectively and legally when it happens. The The other thing that tenants can do to really mess up your plans, other than not paying the rent, is wrecking your property. Often the two go together. If it's a kind of tenant who doesn't want to pay, they probably don't want to treat your property very nicely either. Again, prevention is better than cure on this one. You've got to put the right tenant in there, so all Rob's previous advice applies. References from previous landlords are a big one on this, and that means actually calling the landlords and having a chat with them rather than just like seeing a name on a bit of paper. You can also attempt to lifestyle reference your tenant, and that picks up things that won't appear on a credit check, which is purely about financial matters. There's a site called landlordreferencing.co.uk. We'll link to that in the show notes. And they sell a report for $4.99 that covers ID checks, financial records, and also whether previous landlords or agents have reported problems with behavioural things like damage, criminal behaviour, or anything like that. So that can be really useful because you get tenants who are just bad tenants and they seem very plausible, and there's nothing in their financial records that would make you realise that there was something bad about them. But if you speak to previous landlords, also they're not exactly going to give you the details of their previous landlords if they've been messing them around, but you can use this system to see if anyone has reported anything that means that you need to be suspicious about them. Once you've done that and you're as happy as you can be with your tenant, you've then got to make sure that you or your letting agent does a thorough inventory. And that means that you can prove what the condition was when they moved in. And that means that if there is any damage, malicious or otherwise, you can recover that damage from their deposit by using the evidence. If you've got your inventory, preferably even like an inventory with photos or even a video inventory, to make it really easy to make your case for what they need to pay for. Of course, if they are causing really serious damage that exceeds the amount in the deposit, there's not a great amount you can do other than take them to court, which can be expensive and time-consuming, and they probably don't have the means to pay you anyway if it's serious malicious damage. So that's a real last resort, and hopefully that won't happen. The other thing you can do, if this is something that you're really worried about, is you can actually get cover on your insurance for malicious damage by tenants on some landlord insurance policies. It's not something that's going to be covered on normal home insurance or even basic landlord insurance, but there are some options out there that will cover you for like sort of £25,000 worth or so of damage, malicious damage by tenants. So that's something that I don't think most landlords do it. I don't do it, but it's something that you can look into if damage is a really big concern. If it's going to help you sleep better at night, maybe it's something to think about.
Absolutely, Rob. All those points are solid points. I completely agree with everything you've said then. And the next one, property falls apart. How would you deal with that one?
If your property falls apart, hopefully, again, you want to make sure that you've protected yourself. If your property falls apart, insurance is the only thing you've got there. Hopefully, you're properly insured. You've got buildings insurance and everything. And so if it does fall down around your ears or around your tenant's ears, you're properly covered and you'll be compensated for that. The best thing you can do is make sure that you don't buy a duff property in the first place. The way to do that is to make sure that you get a survey done. Now, if you're getting a mortgage, then they're going to insist that you get a survey done, but it's a pretty superficial one, and it's really only about valuation and protecting their financial interest. For a proper look at the structure of the property, you want to get something called a home buyer report. It normally costs a few £100. And it means that a surveyor will come out and take a look and kind of give you a full sort of 20, 30 page document covering the condition of all the major parts of the house. So the roof and damp in the walls and the floors and all that kind of thing. It's written so it's deliberately easy to understand. It's not all kind of a legal jargon or anything like that. You can take a look at it and see if there's anything wrong. That not only gives you peace of mind, but it means that if you do uncover any issues with the property, you can use that as leverage possibly to get the price down. A survey is something that not everyone does, but it's possibly a good idea to make sure that you're not buying a real duffer. But if you're worried particularly about this kind of thing, if you're not particularly handy and you don't like the idea of having to do a lot of work, then buy accordingly. Go for a newer home or something that's recently been refurbished by someone else. The biggest profits typically are there for the properties that you can buy as a real wreck and do them up and make the profit in return for your hard work. But you don't have to do that. That's just one of many strategies. If you want to buy something that's in absolutely prime condition, someone else has already done the hard work, and you just want to hang on for it, you know the numbers work, and you just want to hang on and see the money come in, not worry about maintenance or anything like that, that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do as well. It's just people worry about potential disasters in different ways. Some people are really freaked out about the idea of the property falling down. Other people are more concerned about not being able to let it. So you can do so much about all of them, but I would say that if you're particularly worried about one of them, then it's worth buying accordingly so you can actually get some sleep.
The new build one is a great example. If this is something that concerns you, then a lot of new builds come with a 10-year structural guarantee. So anything inside the property that's minor won't be covered, but anything, structurally, the roof or anything like that, then you're going to be covered. So if that's something that particularly bothers you, then the new build option may be right for you. Or as Rob said, a refurbished property or something that's nearly new, because if it's a new build that's 2 or 3 years old and it still has the guarantee of the 10 years, then it might have 7 years left to run. So have a look at those guarantees as well, because that could give you the peace of mind if that's something that bothers you. The last one, though, Rob, I had no answers for. This is a true story. I won't name her, but it was a few years back now, and I had a client who went through the typical things. Well, what if I can't get the property let? And what happens if the tenant stops paying? And we went through, and she was fine. And then after running through about 10 plus different things that could go wrong, she was one of these people who's seen the glass half empty rather than half full. She said, in a serious tone, "What happens if my property gets hit by a comet?" Now, I have to say, it's not something I'd been asked of before, and it took me a while to compose myself to answer that question. However, what I would say is that if you are worried about your property getting hit by a comet, do not invest in property, because if you're that negative, of that gloomy and doomy scenarios, then I don't think property investment may be for you. So yeah, all the above, we can give you sensible answers, but unfortunately we don't have any special missiles that can stop comets hitting your property.
Shields to deflect any potential incoming celestial objects is a little bit beyond our remit, and it's probably going to be a bit expensive and put a real dent in your cash flow. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think if your house gets hit by a comet, you've probably got bigger things to worry about on a global scale. So I think the message here is, if you overthink things, you can always come up with a reason for not doing something. Do what you can to prevent all the reasonable things that could go wrong, but once you start getting into black swan scenarios, as they're sometimes called, I think it's time to start either giving up on the whole idea of investment or just stop overthinking it and go for it.
You made a great point there, Rob. If you want to find a reason not to invest in property, you can find one. There's enough out there. With those reasons, as we said, you can minimise risks and you can even prevent them. But if you want to find a reason not to invest, there are plenty there for you. Property investment normally attracts the optimists, the people who want to improve things, the people who believe that their future is going to be a good one. That tends to be the people that gravitate towards property investment because they're trying to better their lives. Negative doom sayers, people who look for the gloom in life, sometimes invest in property, but there's less of them, I'm pleased to say, which means that my job's great because I tend to deal with positive people who are looking to improve their lives, not talk to me about the doom and gloom that's going on. It's a good point. So, which leads us nicely onto the resource of the week, this research and preventive things we've been talking about, because what I'd like to use this week for the resource of the week is a website called checkmyfile.com. In particular, their postcode checker. Now, Check My File is a credit checking facility, and you can do personal credit checks on there. The way I use this website is to check local areas and in particular postcodes. So if we're looking at a new investment, what we'll do, and we put this in our Big 50 report, which is our due diligence document, we'll check the local credit rating. It's a great tool because it tells you the national average and it tells you where that area lies compared to that national average. So have a look. We'll link to it in the show notes. Have a look at your local area. I hope it comes up fine. I'm sure it will. If you're looking at an investment, you can then start comparing different areas against each other. Now, it's not the only tool you should use, and it's not what you should base all your judgments on. But if an area does have a low credit rating, then you need to take that into account. It doesn't mean don't invest, but it means that your risk has increased and you need to assess that. So have a look. It's called Check My File. We'll link to it in our show notes, of course. go ahead, use it. It's completely free and it's a really useful tool that we use in the office all the time.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. It's not one that I've used before, but it's great if you're investing away from an area that you know well, or a really great looking opportunity comes up and it's in an area you're not overly familiar with. I mean, some people like to invest close to home. I know we both invest away from where we live. Like you say, it's one of many different things that you can do to get a better picture of the area and sort of weigh up risk and reward accordingly. I'm sure we're going to feature more kind of online tools like this in future weeks, but it's just really nice to have a little bookmarks folder full of these. So when you're looking into an area, you can just run through and without leaving your desk, you can build up a nice little picture of what you're looking at. So yeah, that's another great resource of the week. And I think that wraps up another show, Rob, doesn't it? That's about all we've got to say for this week. But do let us know what you thought of this week's show. If you've had any property disasters and you want to know what to do about them, or if there are things that we missed off that you think that other people should be aware of, then go over to the website and leave us a comment on there. You could also get your voice on the show if you want to, like Pete did earlier, and leave us your feedback or your questions in the form of a voice message. You can do both those things by going to our website, which is thepropertypodcast.com. And if you want to see the show notes for this episode with all the links and things that we've referred to, you can see that at thepropertypodcast.com/9, because this is episode number 9.
It certainly is. Well, Rob, I think you're nearly due for your siesta. I'm attentive to where you are. I'm following this, even though everyone else is probably struggling to keep up your movements. It's been a great show. We promise next week will be a little bit more upbeat. It won't be as negative, but I'm glad we covered what we have today to show you that property can be absolutely fantastic, but you just need to make sure you put certain procedures, certain things in place to reduce your risks so you stand a far better chance of having a really successful portfolio. But it's been great. I've really enjoyed this week, Rob, and I look forward to catching up with you next Thursday.
Yeah, and next week we're going to be talking about whether you should buy to let or buy to sell. Kind of different strategies. Both can be great. It depends on your goals, and we're obsessed with goals. I'm sure we'll be mentioning those a lot. But that's going to be the topic of next week's show, so please join us then.
Fantastic. Okay, guys, we look forward to speaking with you next Thursday.
Thank you for listening to the Property Podcast. Don't forget to check out the show notes and join the mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.